April 1945. Eastern Germany. The village, burned and twisted, smelled of smoke and rotting flesh. The wind drove scraps of paper and ash through the streets. In the basement of a half-ruined house, where a German garrison had recently stood, 5 women were hiding. All of them had once been comfort women, those whom soldiers whispered about as if it were just part of their duty. Greta, 20, with a face too childlike for eyes that had seen too much. Anna, a former nurse who stopped believing in God after a doctor ordered her to serve officers for saving one of their wounded. Fried, old, 40 but looking 60. She smoked and stayed silent. Martha, their unspoken leader, the only one who still could keep her back straight. And Liza, fragile, pregnant, in her final month, speaking almost nothing. Outside, the roar of engines, English shouts. The Americans had entered the village. The women huddled in a corner. Greta held a piece of cloth with a red cross. Her only attempt to prove she wasn't a prostitute, but a medical assistant. Though everyone knew it was a lie. Will they do to us what ours did to the Russians? Greta whispered, barely breathing. Martha looked at her slowly. Don't hope it will be different, she replied quietly. War erases faces for everyone. The basement door slammed open. The flashlight blinded them. An American soldier stood in the doorway, tall, dusty, with a face mixed with fatigue and something like pity. He looked at the women, lowered his weapon, and said calmly, almost gently, "It's over. You're safe now." None of them believed it. Greta covered her face and began to cry. Martha, however, stared at the soldier without blinking. Only one question echoed in her mind. What does safe mean? The Americans entered the village without firing a shot. The Germans had retreated during the night, leaving behind weapons, abandoned trucks, and frightened civilians. When the first jeeps and Sherman tanks rolled down the main street, villagers cautiously peeked from basements and crumbling doorways, eyes squinting against the sunlight, bodies thin from hunger, faces pale and haunted. The air smelled of smoke, gasoline, and raw human fear. Martha and the other women were led out of the basement under the soldiers' watchful eyes, not roughly, but with careful distance. The soldiers didn't know who they were. Spies, prisoners, locals. Each step carried the weight of uncertainty. They were stopped at an old, bullet-scarred church. One of the Americans, a sergeant with a tired, lined face, scrutinized them from head to toe. "They're not soldiers," he said quietly. "They're just women." His voice carried no pity, only confusion, as if he truly didn't know what to do with them now. They were given blankets. Greta, in disbelief, grabbed a piece of bread and tucked it under her coat like a thief. Anna took water, trembling as she drank it, and immediately began to cry. The soldiers didn't laugh. One approached, removed his helmet, and nodded lightly, as if apologizing for something that had never happened. By evening, the women were moved to the school building. The blackboard was riddled with bullet holes. A burned portrait of Hitler hung crookedly on the wall. Straw covered the floor. Each woman received a blanket and a bowl of porridge. No one touched them. Not a single look held desire. Only exhaustion and perhaps disgust. Liza, barely keeping her balance, whispered, They're not like ours." Martha studied her with a long, steady gaze. Not yet night, but the night passed quietly. Only distant gunfire echoed, the dying heartbeat of a war that had already begun to crumble. The next morning, a young captain arrived, accompanied by a female translator with short hair and a strong voice that carried authority. "These women," the soldier reported, "say they were used by Wehrmacht soldiers." The captain remained silent for a long moment, then quietly said in English, "No punishment. No humiliation. They've had enough." The translator conveyed his words. The women didn't understand immediately. Only after a pause did it sink in. They would not be judged. No one would touch them. Greta began to cry again, clenching her fists as if afraid to believe tears could be shed freely. Anna turned away, overwhelmed by unexpected kindness. She was used to pain, not mercy. Fried just lit a cigarette, her hands trembling as she shielded the flame. Martha stood straight, walking to the captain and asking through the translator, "Why don't you ask who we are? What we did. The captain looked her in the eyes. We know, he said quietly, and that's enough. He turned to leave, but Martha spoke again. If you think this is forgiveness, you are wrong. The captain paused, said nothing, simply nodded and left. That evening, Martha sat by a broken window, watching the American soldier standing guard outside. He was softly whistling a tune under his breath, a melody she had never heard before, something alien to this world. And for the first time in years of war, Martha realized she was hearing not screams, not orders, not moans, but music. And it frightened her more than anything else. A week passed. The Americans fortified their positions, set up communication lines, and brought a generator. For the first time in months, the village was lit by electric light. But for the women, the light offered no warmth. It only highlighted everything that had become visible. Dirt-streaked skin, scars, empty eyes. Greta sat against the wall, fingers tracing the edges of a broken mirror. She looked into it, as if trying to remember who she had been. Each day, she thought more and more that maybe it would have been better to die with those who hadn't survived. Anna assisted the American doctor. He treated locals and sometimes let her hold the bandages. She moved mechanically like a machine. But every time she saw an American in a white coat, her heart clenched. Before her eyes flashed images of German doctors who turned pain into punishment. Liza grew quieter by the day. Her belly had become heavy as stone. Martha tried to help, but she knew childbirth was a risk. None of the Americans knew what to do with a pregnant German woman. Some said, "Let her rest. She's not our problem." Others replied, "She's human. That's enough." At night, Martha woke to a suffocating silence, one that pressed down, as if hiding screams within. She went outside. The air was cold, the stars hanging low, almost brushing the rooftops. A young guard noticed her, but did not raise his weapon. "Can't sleep?" he asked with a smile. Martha didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She answered softly, "Nicht schlafen nicht." The soldier shrugged and handed her a tin cup of coffee. She took it. The smell was bitter, burning, but alive. He said simply, "War's over." Martha stared at him without blinking. "No," she answered in German. "The war inside hasn't ended." He didn't understand the words, but somehow he felt the meaning. He simply nodded and said nothing more. By morning, Liza began to give birth. No screams, only a dull groan muffled, as if through teeth. Anna and Martha held her hands. Greta boiled water. The American doctor rushed in, froze. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he had never seen enemies giving birth to life. When the child cried, everyone froze. For the first time in a long while, Martha felt something stir inside her. A small, thin, living cry broke through the concrete of fear. She realized this sound was the first that did not smell of death. That day, the Americans brought the women extra rations. Someone smiled, someone simply nodded. For the first time in months, a trace of humanity hung in the air. But Martha knew what lay ahead was not forgiveness, but emptiness. Because when the torture stops, all that remains is to look at yourself. And that can be more frightening than war. The child was born pale, tiny, but alive. A boy. Liza named him Joseph, though she told no one why. Perhaps because his father had also been named Joseph, or perhaps because it was the only name she remembered from her past life. The Americans didn't know what to do with him. To them, he was the enemy's child. One soldier muttered quietly, almost with disgust, "A Nazi baby." But the doctor sharply interrupted him. "No, just a baby." From that moment, they were treated differently. Someone brought warm milk, someone left chocolate. One young soldier from Texas, freckled and gentle voice, once gave Liza his jacket to wrap the baby in. She took it, but didn't say thank you. She didn't know how to be grateful. Martha observed silently. She felt the camp slowly changing. The Americans laughed, smoked, and sang in the evenings. The German women listened. For the first time, they began to understand how the world sounded without fear. But in the quiet nights, Martha increasingly dreamed, not of the war, but of what would come after. She saw herself and the other women freed, but still marked. She saw Greta returning home, and her mother shutting the door in her face. She saw Enola Church, and everyone turning away. She saw Eliza holding her child, uncertain of who he would become. And in each dream, one feeling remained. It was far from over. One night, Martha heard soft crying. She rose and found Liza by the window, holding Joseph. "He looks like him," Liza said. "Like who?" "The officer who—" Her voice shook. "I thought I hated him. But now, looking at my son, I don't know." Martha didn't reply. She simply approached and took the child in her arms. The tiny, warm body trembled, but the breathing was steady. "He is not guilty," she said softly. "No child is guilty of an adult's sins." Liza looked up. For the first time, a faint spark of faith appeared in her eyes. "And us?" she asked. "Can we be innocent?" Martha gazed into the darkness beyond the window. "No," she said after a pause. "But perhaps we can simply be alive." The next day, the captain returned. He asked the translator, "Tell them they will soon go to a registration center. They will be registered as civilians." The women exchanged glances. Civilians. The word felt foreign. After everything they had endured, they did not feel human. As the captain turned to leave, Martha suddenly asked, "What will happen to the child?" He paused, then said, "If the mother wants, he will go with her. And if she doesn't, then the Americans will take him." And added, "We do not let babies die, even if they were born on the wrong side." Martha nodded. For the first time, she thought the world might, after all, be capable of justice. Not justice that punishes, but that simply allows life to continue. But somewhere deep inside, she knew this world would never be the same again. And for them, and for this child, the war had not ended. It had simply changed its form. 2 weeks later, the Americans began evacuating civilians from the destroyed villages. Trucks loaded with people and the wreckage of other lives moved along roads recently torn by tanks. Spring was taking hold. The first leaves, the scent of wet earth. Nature seemed to mock the devastation, growing alive over the bones. The women rode with other refugees. Liza held Joseph wrapped in a military blanket, bearing the American emblem. Greta remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ground, as if afraid to see the sky. Anna clutched bandages and a canteen in her lap, her work. She needed something to do to avoid feeling the void. Martha sat at the open side of the truck, staring at the passing landscape. Ruined houses, abandoned artillery, crosses by the roadside. Occasionally, they saw people. Some waved. Some spat on the ground when they saw German uniforms, even tattered and stripped of insignia. "Where are they taking us?" Greta asked. "To registration," Martha replied. "Then probably home." "What does home mean?" Greta whispered. "If it's gone." Martha said nothing. She knew. For many of them, home no longer existed. Only empty walls where bread once smelled, and faces they might never recognize again. At one of the stops, they paused at a ruined church. The Americans distributed food. Martha approached the guard and quietly said, "Danke." He nodded. Then, after a short pause, he asked in English, "Do you believe in God?" Martha didn't understand, but heard the word God. She smiled, tired, without mockery. "If he exists, he has been silent too long." The guard lowered his gaze. "Maybe he was busy," he said. Martha smirked, or simply turned away. Later, as they moved again, a column of Soviet prisoners appeared along the road. Thin, in torn coats, barefoot. The Americans looked at them with unease. No one knew what to do. One Soviet soldier met Martha's eyes from the truck. He said nothing, but in his gaze was everything. Hatred, pain, recognition. Martha understood. To these men, they were not victims. They were a symbol of the enemy. And no kindness from the Americans could erase that mark. As the sun began to set, the truck stopped atop a hill. Below, the city came into view, half burned but still alive. Amid the ruins, they would have to begin again. Liza looked down, holding the child, and whispered, "Do you think, Martha, he will grow up and know who his father was? Martha didn't answer immediately. Yes. And what will he say? Martha looked at the setting sun. Maybe he'll just say he wants to be different. As the trucks moved onward, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of freedom. But freedom is not warmth. It is cold, cold that exposes everything you've tried to forget. The city they arrived at was called Halberstadt, once a quiet industrial center, now a scar on the map of Germany. Half-ruined streets, blackened walls, the smell of smoke and chalk. People lived in basements, craters under bridges. Each person carried a story no one wanted to tell. The Americans turned the women over to the local commandant. A young, tired officer sifted through papers. They need housing, he said in broken German, and work. No one asked who they had been. No one wanted to know. The past had become a dangerous currency. It could earn you a beating, pity, or simply be ignored. They were settled in an old house belonging to a teacher killed in a bombing. Cracked walls, dust, cold in the kitchen. But there was a roof, and that already counted as luxury. Greta tried to find her mother. She wrote letters, appealed to the Red Cross, waited. The reply came a month later. Your home is destroyed. Mother and sister missing. She didn't cry. She folded the letter into her pocket and went to chop wood. Anna took a position at a field hospital. The Americans employed German nurses if they had any skills. Each time she bandaged a soldier or a child, she remembered doing the same before, but then under orders, without the right to feel compassion. Now she worked silently, as if atoning for every wound she had failed to prevent. Liza stayed constantly with the child. Joseph grew, and the older he became, the more he cared of his father, not in appearance, but in movement, in the look of his eyes, and how he clenched his fists when something displeased him. Martha noticed, but remained silent. She knew there was no guilt in the child. Yet Liza seemed to begin fearing her own son. Sometimes at night, Liza would go outside, standing in the rain until she shivered from the cold. Martha would find her, return her to house, cover her with a blanket. It's okay, she whispered. No, Liza replied. I hear him cry, and I think this cry isn't his, it's mine. Martha tried to work, sweeping streets, helping with bread distribution. People recognized her as a camp woman, not from a concentration camp, but as one of those whispered about with disgust, the one who slept with officers. She did not defend herself. When someone spat at her feet, she simply wiped it with her shoe and walked on. One evening, sitting with Anna by the window, Martha said, We're alive. And so, Anna answered wearily, That's all we have left. Anna nodded. Alive doesn't mean saved. In the spring of 1946, the German police returned to the city, new, American-controlled. They compiled lists who had been where, who had served, who had survived. When they reached their house, the officer asked Martha, What were you during the Wehrmacht? She looked him straight in the eyes, not flinching. No one, he wrote, refugee, and in that moment, she understood for the first time. Sometimes to survive, you must agree to be no one. That evening, Martha stepped outside. The moon hung pale in the sky, like a faded flag. She looked at the city, at the smoking ruins, at the faint laughter of children from a nearby basement. And for the first time in months, she felt not pain, not guilt, not fear, but something like calm, fragile like a child's breath. She knew scars, judgment, and loneliness would follow, but at this moment, she allowed herself to believe that a human could be more than an enemy, even if he was German, even if she was a woman who had survived where surviving had been shameful. For years past, 1949, Germany divided, ruined, hungry, and weary. In Halberstadt, Soviet troops now occupied the city. The Americans had left. Red flags, slogans, a new authority. But for Martha, Anna, Greta, and Liza, nothing had changed. They still lived on the margins of someone else's world. Joseph grew up. Light hair, gray eyes, the very eyes Liza had feared. He didn't speak much, but he listened carefully, remembering faces, voices, shadows. Sometimes he asked his mother, Mom, where's my father? Liza froze. He was a soldier. He died. Was he good? Yes, she answered after a long pause. Probably. Joseph didn't understand why his mother cried after saying this. Martha loved the boy in her way. Quietly, strictly restrained. She saw in him not an enemy, not the child of a rapist, but a chance to prove that goodness was not just a word that had lost meaning during the war. She taught him to read. On old newspapers, scraps of paper, tin labels from canned food, Joseph grasped quickly, stubbornly forming letters. One day he said, "I will be a teacher." Martha smiled. "Then teach us all to live again." Greta changed in those years. She became withdrawn, often lost in herself. Rumors spread that at night she met with Soviet soldiers, for bread, for butter, for warmth. Martha tried to speak to her, but Greta would only throw back, "Do you think I'm worse than I was?" and walk away. Anna, meanwhile, worked as a nurse at the Red Cross hospital. She no longer feared blood, but each patient reminded her of the past. Sometimes she would come to Martha and simply sit in silence, listening to a child laughing behind the walls. "Do you hear it?" she would say. "This laughter, proof that God remembered us after all." Martha nodded, but only for a short while. One day, Joseph brought home a scrap of newspaper from school. On the front page, Nuremberg sentences executed. Last Nazis hanged. He showed it to his mother. "Mom, we're the Nazis." Liza paled. Martha approached and took the paper from his hands. People who forgot that others are also human. Joseph frowned. "And was that a Nazi?" Liza turned away. Martha wanted to answer, but stayed silent. Later that night, Liza sat by the window, holding the newspaper. In the photo, faces of the hanged. Not his, but still similar. Joseph slept beside her, quietly, peacefully. She watched him and thought, in every person, perhaps, live both good and evil, and it all depends on who names it first. In spring, Martha fell ill. Old age caught her suddenly, like a cold wind. She lay covered in an old coat, holding Joseph's hand. "Listen, boy," she said with effort. "Don't let anyone tell you that you're guilty of who your father was." Joseph nodded, not fully understanding. "And who was my father?" he asked. Martha looked him in the eyes. "A man who caused pain." "And I won't." She smiled. "Only if you forget how it feels to be the one hurt." After her death, the house felt empty. Liza stayed silent for weeks. Joseph went to school, helped Anna at the hospital, brought food. Everything seemed better. But sometimes he heard his mother whispering in her sleep, "Forgive me, forgive me." Joseph didn't know whom she was speaking to, but somehow he felt that one day he would have to answer those words. Joseph grew quickly like grass on the ruins. In his childhood, there was no war anymore, but its shadows lingered in every glance, in every silence. He walked through ruined streets, where smoke and dust still hung, where people watched cautiously. Old eyes remembering screams, new ones learning to fear. Liza still carried the weight of the past. Every morning began with checking if Joseph slept, if he was cold, if he was hungry. Every word was careful, every movement, an attempt to shield the child from the world that had broken her. Martha was no longer there. Her death left a void no one could fill. Greta remained withdrawn, visiting rarely, leaving silently. Anna tried to maintain order in the house, tending bodies, but she could not heal souls. Joseph listened to the women's stories of war. Sometimes he heard about atrocities, about violence, about fear and humiliation. He tried to understand how someone could survive it and stay alive. "Why did you tell me this?" he asked once. "To let you know," Liza said. "So you understand that the world can be cruel. And if I am cruel, then remember us," she said, "and understand how hard it is." At school, Joseph faced misunderstanding. Other children didn't know about his past, but they sensed a strangeness, as if he carried someone else's pain. He learned to be silent. He learned to be cautious. He learned to ask himself who he would become if his mother's past became a part of him. Martha lived in his memory, like a shadow. Not a threat, not fear, but a constant whisper. Don't forget who you might be if you lose caution. Joseph realized. The generation that wasn't asked, the children of war, born where adults should have decided everything. This generation pays for the mistakes of others. He grew, and with each year understood more, that the world is not fair, that people continue to hurt others even when war is over, that survival is not victory. It is only a chance to look at the light and recognize that it exists, however small, somewhere. Joseph once approached Liza with a drawing in his hands. It showed a family, a mother, a child, a woman with a serious gaze. "Is this us?" he asked. "Yes," Liza said, "but not completely." "Why?" "Because we are still learning to live," she replied. Joseph nodded. He understood. Living after war is also an art, but art is painful. Every feeling, every glance, a reflection of what others endured. And Joseph felt it, like a shadow on his shoulder, like cold wine to the house. He understood that even if the war was gone, its echo would remain with him forever. And then he understood the most important thing, the generation that wasn't asked. It is the one learning to live among the ruins of other people's decisions. Halberstadt gradually came back to life. On the ruins, new houses appeared, small shops opened selling bread, milk, sugar. But the women still felt like outsiders. Old neighbors whispered about them, sometimes through sidelong glances. Even those who helped did so cautiously, as if the fear of the past was contagious. Joseph was already attending school. He learned to read, write, understand a world that seemed kind but remained cold. Sometimes he ran home to show Liza new words, drawings, victories. "Look, Mom," he shouted, "I wrote life." Liza smiled, but her eyes were sad. "Life," she repeated. "Try to remember this word, Joseph." Greta still lived apart. Sometimes she came by to fix something in the house or help with Joseph. She remained silent, asked no questions, demanded no explanations. Her presence was nearly invisible, but her shadow reminded everyone that the past was still close. Anna now worked at the hospital. She saw the wounds of others, learned to heal not just bodies but also souls. Sometimes she caught herself thinking, we ourselves are not whole yet. Martha had long since died, but her memory lived in every thought, in every step they took carefully. And Joseph grew with that whisper in his mind. Do not do what brought pain to your mother. One day, Joseph decided to go to the river. He stood on the bank, watching the water flow, and felt for the first time that he saw something alive, untouched by war. He picked up a stone, threw it into the river, and watched the ripples spread across the surface. And Joseph understood this is how life can begin again, with small, barely noticeable, but real steps. Liza stood beside him. The first step into the world, she said quietly. Why the first? Joseph asked. Because the past held our hands too long. Now we can walk on our own. He smiled, and for the first time, he felt that the world was not only darkness, but the darkness had not disappeared. It remained in the scars on the walls, in the scars on people, in the scars on hearts. And Joseph knew every step into the world was a struggle. Sometimes victory would be sweet, sometimes bitter, but one must keep walking. And he walked. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to the channel, give a like, and hit the bell to never miss a new video. Leave a comment telling us which story you'd like to see next.